you may have heard this story over the course of the weekend. In Gaza, 3 hostages emerged from a building. They were carrying a makeshift white flag. They had also attempted to create a sign with food saying that they were hostages. And
help 3 hostages was reportedly painted in Hebrew on the flag as well.
And they were shot immediately as they came out with the white flag. They had their shirts off so they could show that there were no bombs attached to their chest. They were shot, and apparently the only reason why they found out that they were hostages, and the reason why they checked, was one of them, at least, appeared more supposedly Western. And specifically, one of them had longer, and this is according to NBC News, long ginger hair and blue eyes. This is what stopped the Israeli soldiers to check on their identities.
And at least this person, Haim, the redheaded person, was supposed to perform in at the festival where the hostages were taken.
At a music festival in Tel Aviv.
Oh, not the same
7th,
one?
Different one.
Okay, so
I guess.
apologies.
But yeah, but they weren't. None of the 3, as far as I can tell, were part of the IDF when they were taken hostage.
Okay, so they were civilian hostages, and the IDF shot them dead, despite them not wearing shirts, despite them holding their hands up in the air, waving white flags. And in addition to this obviously being an outrage in Israel, where presumably the failure of Hamas to release the hostages is part of the justification for this massive assault. But what it really goes to the heart of is, if this is the way they are treating civilians or just people who have their shirts off and a white flag in the air, people who are actively both aware of the way the IDF might approach them, which is why they took their shirts off. They were savvy enough to know that. They apparently, one of the guys who was killed ran back in, or attempted to run back into the building yelling Hebrew. And if this is the way that they treat people who with a white flag and their shirts off, who are they not shooting? We're told time and time again that the Israeli military, unlike any other military in the history of all war, treats civilians with special care. Yet tens of thousands or 20,000 dead in bombing.
In 10 weeks.
98,000 buildings leveled. And when they're hand-to-hand battle, right, which we were told specifically, we're doing this because we want to protect civilians. And these people are summarily shot. And the only reason why we heard this story, let's be clear, is because one of the victims had red hair. And it caused them to think, hey, wait a second. This isn't one of the typical people that we shoot.
Yeah. They didn't have plausible deniability in that point, especially because it was on the ground. There will be undoubtedly hostages that are killed in the bombing, but those will be blamed on Hamas because it won't have been from the gun of an IDF soldier. I just sent this just because I want to put into context. Israel has a history of shooting civilians who are holding white flags. This is from Human Rights Watch in 2009, where they documented 7 instances where Israeli soldiers fired on civilians with small arms during an operation in Gaza in 2008 and 2009, 2 months, December 2008 and 2009. These attacks killed 11 civilians, including 5 women and 4 children, and wounded at least another 8. In each case, the victims were standing, walking, or in a slowly moving vehicle with other unarmed children who were trying to convey their non-combatant status by waving a white flag. And I wanted to clarify if all of these instances, if you could go to the next screenshot, were instances where they were waving a white flag. And according to Human Rights Watch in 2009, that's the case. They found no evidence that the civilian victims were used by Palestinian fighters as human shields. You can hear that language again. Or were shot in the crossfire between opposing forces. In each of the 7 cases, at least one person was waving an improvised white flag made from cloth or clothes, which international humanitarian law recognizes as a sign of truce or surrender, meaning the IDF has encountered Palestinians with white flags before, and it doesn't matter to them whatsoever. They'll kill them regardless, and that's why they shot these people who ended up being Israeli hostages.
And to be clear, you will definitely hear the excuse that, well, Hamas has in the past used white flags to trick the IDF. So far, in all the reporting I've heard of that being an excuse floated, there has been no details to flesh out that report. Nevertheless, if it is the case that they're going to shoot people even with white flags, the even part is relevant. They're just shooting whoever they see. Now, maybe, if that person looks young enough, but we know that the IDF has a history of shooting children who, supposedly were throwing rocks at them or something to that effect. But it should give you a sense of the parameters in which they're engaging in these things. And yes, I imagine in battle there is you are trigger happy in certain instances. But the fact is that you can't then go and say we're taking extra precautions to protect citizens and that these numbers are fake and all these things when you're gunning down people who had the best possible knowledge one could have in how to approach the IDF in that situation, and they still were shot dead.
Yeah.
But here is Benjamin Netanyahu. He's at a news conference. This is in Hebrew, but there's translation. He is asked.
We don't have that question, unfortunately.
We don't have the question, but this clip is supposedly in response to a question about the killing, the Israeli killing of these hostages. And he immediately pivots to this. I am proud to have prevented the establishment of a Palestinian state because today everyone knows what a Palestinian state could have been after the war. The little Palestinian state in Gaza, everyone knows what could have been if we had succumbed to international pressure and allowed for a state like that in Judea and Samaria, that's the West Bank, around Jerusalem and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. So to be clear, this guy's bragging that his career, 25 years worth of plus of being a politician, and a military one prior to that, maybe 30 years now, 40 years of being a politician, has been dedicated to preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state. So when we hear, or we don't hear it anymore because they don't even bother, there's no one to negotiate with across the table. Understand, that was always disingenuous. They were specifically, that's why they built up Hamas. And by they, I mean Netanyahu. This is his own words.
Yeah.
It's also reported in the Forward magazine back in the, I think it was in the 90s, that Hamas was nurtured by Israel in the late 80s as a way to undermine the cohesion of Palestinian leadership and the political leadership and political system so that they could not come together and push for a Palestinian state at that time. So understand, there's never been, to make an assessment that there haven't been one set of partners on one side of the table is completely belied by the fact that it turns out the Israelis never had that interest. Certainly not since Rabin was assassinated.
Well, I mean, I read this from 972 the other day, and even that, Rabin assassination, he never used the word the Palestinian state. Yeah. In the accords that he signed, a fact that he and other Israeli officials were careful to ensure. A month before his assassination, Rabin told the Knesset that his vision was to give Palestinians, quote, an entity which is less than the state, a precedent to the state minus advocated today by Netanyahu. This was in 2020 and outlined in Trump's deal of the century. Rabin also insisted that the Jordan Valley would remain Israel's security border, the very plan that drew international outcry this year when Netanyahu pledged to formally annex the area. Rabin's government used Oslo not as a blueprint to end the occupation, but to restructure it and minimize the cost to Israelis. The burden of controlling the occupied population was transferred to the newly created Palestinian Authority, blah, blah, blah. Essentially,
we're not going to give you a state. We'll give you a state-lit.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even like the poster boy of liberal Zionism of like the past few decades in Israel was not really serious about a Palestinian state.
He just recognized them as people, and that was too much. Yeah,
like these poll numbers here that I sent from within Israel, I think, are really important. This is a Hebrew University poll that shows that 71% of Israelis, including 45% of those who voted for the Likud ruling party, think Netanyahu must resign immediately after the end of the military campaign in Gaza.
After
Immediately, but this shows that Netanyahu does not have any incentive to end the mass killing in Gaza. In fact, he is disincentivized from doing so because the Israeli population will call for an election to get him out of office at that point, and he will no longer be in power. It doesn't mean that who Israelis vote in will be in any way like some sort of liberal. I mean, apparently Benny Gantz is the preferred prime minister for 22% of Likud voters, as you can see in the link below there as well. But the point is just like when he obfuscates Netanyahu and changes the subject when asked about the 3 Israeli hostages that were killed by the IDF, that is also borne out in practice where he can't really contend with anything that is happening in Gaza, any of the mass killing, because he has to keep doing so in order to stay in power. And you mentioned obviously that the Israeli government bolstered Hamas when he says there in that quote, like, I'm so glad that we prevented the Palestinian state from being established because look at what could have happened. He knows exactly what he's doing because they want Hamas to be empowered there so they can basically say this extremist population is incompatible with notions of democracy. And if we were to give them any kind of established state, or if they were to have political rights, then you know what they'd do with it? They'd kill all the Jews. They'd kill all of us. So we have no choice but to ethnically cleanse them. We have no choice but to kill them because they had the option and they chose extremism because they hate Jews so much. That's what he rests on.
Right.
And like, let's be clear, that's not true. It's also an extremely racist notion. So like liberal Zionists in this country, it's time to wake up to the white supremacy of Netanyahu's ideology.
That's the thing is like this is like it's like a, oh my God, he admitted moment, like I think you should leave.
Yeah,
but it's also like this has been sort of openly known, and the only problem is like I see like Noah, I can't remember who it is, like liberal bloggers. And they'd be like, well, if this is true, then let's stop supporting them. It's like, this is what everybody on the left has been saying is true of Israel this entire time. And you've been calling them like borderline anti-Semitic for it. But this is just like the reality that every adult has been dealing with.
How many times have former Israeli government officials referred to what's going on there as apartheid? Yeah. I mean, over the past 5 years.
How many times?
Here is former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. This was, I don't know, I guess 2 weeks ago on Turkish television. And, you know, this is not, Ehud Olmert is not some radical lefty. Here he is speaking about Netanyahu.
Netanyahu is a national historical disaster for Israel. He has to go. Ben Gvir is a terrible event. Smotrich is a terrible event. The Hilltop Youth in the territories, in the West Bank, is a terrible event. What I think about Ben Gvir and his friends, I've spelled out in Israel, not in Turkey, in Israel, in front of them, in the most extreme manner. I call them enemies. I say that they are butchers, that they are killers, they are murderers, they are terrorists. I said it on my own people, on my own minister. Since 2009, the Israeli policy was absolutely negative, was not really prepared to embark on a meaningful process that was essential. They have not followed the policy that I've outlined, which carried a real chance for peace, and I don't release the Israeli government from 2009 of its responsibility for the lack of communication. I think that he's a danger to Israel, that he should be immediately fired, that he should be thrown out, that his bedtime, because of many reasons which have nothing to do with Palestinians.
So, in other words, I mean, imagine, the idea of if he was a college student at Ehud Olmert and saying that for the past 15 years, and I would argue it's been longer than that, but let's just take it on his terms. The past 15 years that the Israeli government, their policy has been specifically for anything but peace. And that Netanyahu's government is full of murderers and butchers and killers. Imagine that guy is a undergraduate student, let's say a Brown. At what point do they get arraigned? At what point are they censured? The group that they're part of is not allowed to be there anymore.
Are you here on a student visa? Look out.
I mean, the Israeli, it is deeply frustrating to see liberals in this country being, doe-eyed about the Israeli government when this has been well documented for years at this point. Now the New York Times is reporting weeks after. Last week they had the report about how the Netanyahu government has bolstered Hamas, and it's like, golly gee, have you paid any attention to what Haaretz and the Times of Israel and Israeli papers have been saying on this front for years and years? This is not news. It's just the explicit policy.
Just read Gideon Levy. one Israeli from Haaretz, and who's been writing about this for decade plus now.